December 13th, 1943 began like many other tense mornings over the jungles of Assam, but within minutes it would turn into something no training manual had ever prepared a pilot for. The air was thick and heavy, the kind that dulled engine performance and tested both machine and pilot. Below, the dense green canopy stretched endlessly, broken only by the narrow, vulnerable strip of Dinjan airfield, a critical outpost in a forgotten corner of the war. Dinjan was not just another base, it was a lifeline. From here, American transport aircraft climbed into the sky every day, carrying fuel, weapons, and supplies over the towering Himalayas into China. Pilots called that route the Hump, and it was one of the most dangerous air operations of the entire war. Sudden storms, freezing temperatures, and unpredictable winds claimed aircraft regularly. But despite all that, the flights continued, because they had to. If Dinjan fell, that supply line could collapse overnight. On that morning, however, Dinjan had a different problem. It had almost no protection. Most of the fighters that should have been guarding the airfield were either grounded, refueling, or deployed elsewhere. The skies above the base were nearly empty. Nearly. Because already airborne, flying a routine patrol, was one pilot, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair. From the cockpit of his P-40N Warhawk, the world looked deceptively calm. The engine's steady vibration, the familiar layout of the controls, the endless horizon. It was almost easy to forget how quickly everything could change. Adair scanned the sky out of habit, his eyes moving constantly, trained to notice even the smallest irregularity. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a faint distortion far in the distance, a shimmer that didn't quite match the movement of clouds or light. For a brief moment, it could have been dismissed, but experience told him otherwise. He kept watching. The shape grew. What had been a blur began to separate into multiple points, then dozens, and then, unmistakably, into a formation. Adair leaned forward slightly, focusing harder. His mind began to process what his eyes were confirming. This wasn't a small patrol or a scattered group of aircraft. This was organized, deliberate, massive. As the distance closed, the formation revealed its structure. Below, in tight, disciplined lines, flew medium bombers, steady, unwavering, locked on course. Above and surrounding them, faster fighters moved like a living shield, shifting position with purpose. It was a classic strike formation, designed for one thing, to reach a target and destroy it. And their heading left no doubt. They were coming for Dinjan. The number was almost impossible to process at first. 64 aircraft, 24 bombers, each capable of carrying enough explosives to devastate the airfield, escorted by 40 fighters ready to intercept anything that got close. On the ground, there was no time for a coordinated defense. Even if the alarm had already sounded, scrambling fighters would take precious minutes Dinjan didn't have. Rows of parked transport planes sat exposed, loaded with fuel and cargo. Maintenance crews, supply depots, ammunition stores, everything was vulnerable. In the air, Adair understood the situation instantly. He was the only thing between that formation and the base. For a brief moment, the reality of it settled in. One aircraft, one pilot, against an entire strike force. Training offered a clear answer. No engagement, report the sighting, preserve the aircraft, live to fight under better conditions. No manual, no instructor, no briefing had ever suggested that a single fighter should directly attack a formation like this. But war had a way of ignoring rules. Adair didn't turn away. Instead, he pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared louder as the P-40 accelerated, cutting through the humid air. The decision was made in seconds, but it carried enormous weight. He wasn't trying to win a battle in the traditional sense. He didn't need to shoot down all 64 aircraft. That was impossible. He just needed to disrupt them. Even a few seconds of confusion, forcing the bombers to break formation, to hesitate, to drop their payloads early,
could be enough to save the airfield, enough to save the transports, enough to keep the Hump airlift alive. As he closed the distance, the formation ahead grew from distant shapes into individual machines. He could almost feel the scale of it now. The bombers moved with cold precision, engines droning in unison, while the escort fighters weaved above them like living predators. Then, suddenly, the formation reacted. They had seen him. From their perspective, it must have been a strange sight, a single American fighter charging directly towards them, alone, with no support. It didn't make sense, and in combat, anything that didn't make sense was dangerous. The escort fighters began to break formation, peeling away in groups. Their movements were sharp, controlled, and immediate. They weren't going to wait for him to reach the bombers. They were coming to stop him. The sky that had seemed so vast just moments ago was now collapsing into a tight, deadly arena. Speed increased, distance vanished. Every second now mattered more than the last. Inside the cockpit, Adair adjusted his approach, angling his aircraft to slip past the incoming fighters. His target wasn't them, not yet. The bombers were the key. If he could reach them, if he could hit even one, force even a slight disruption, it might be enough. But the fighters were closing fast. What had started as a distant encounter was now seconds away from a full engagement. Adair didn't hesitate. He kept going, because below him, Dinjan airfield had no idea how close it was to destruction. And above it, there was still only one man standing in the way.
The moment the first Japanese fighters broke away from their formation, the encounter stopped being a calculated interception and became a fight for survival. The sky ahead was no longer a distant objective, it was a closing wall of speed, metal, and intent. What Philip Adair had chosen to do just seconds earlier now unfolded into its full reality. He was flying straight into a defensive screen designed specifically to destroy aircraft like his. The escort fighters moved with precision, diving toward him from above and angling in from the sides. Their advantage was clear: numbers, positioning, and coordination. They weren't reacting emotionally, they were executing a system that had been refined through months of combat. Adair adjusted his course slightly, refusing to turn away completely. If he broke off now, the bombers would continue unchallenged. That was not an option. Instead, he aimed for a narrow gap forming between two approaching fighters, pushing his aircraft forward with controlled aggression. The distance collapsed in seconds. Tracers streaked past his canopy, thin, glowing lines cutting through the air where he had been just a fraction of a second earlier. He felt the instinct to pull hard, to evade, but he held his line just long enough to slip through the first layer of defense. For a brief moment, it worked. He was through. The bombers were now directly ahead of him, larger than before, steady and exposed for the first time since he had spotted them. Their formation, while tight, was not designed to withstand a direct close-range attack from within. That vulnerability was exactly what Adair had gambled on. He pushed the nose down slightly and lined up his approach. There was no time for hesitation, no time for a perfect shot. He squeezed the trigger. The P-40's guns erupted, the recoil vibrating through the entire aircraft. Tracers reached forward into the formation, striking toward one of the bombers. Whether the rounds hit critical components or not almost didn't matter in that instant. The goal was disruption. And disruption is exactly what followed. The bombered formation began to shift, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to break their perfect alignment, enough to force decisions inside cockpits that had been operating on strict timing just seconds earlier. But the window was closing. The escort fighters had not been shaken off. If anything, his attack had drawn them in faster. Adair pulled up and rolled slightly, trying to reposition for another pass, but the sky around him was already filling with movement. One fighter flashed past his wing, another came in from behind. The situation had flipped in an instant.
Now he was the target. He pushed the P-40 into a dive, using speed as his only real advantage. The Warhawk was not the most maneuverable aircraft in the sky, but it could take punishment and build speed quickly. That was his edge. If he could stay fast, unpredictable, and aggressive, he might survive long enough to make another attack. But the Japanese fighters were relentless. They followed him down, closing the distance with alarming speed. Tracers began to appear again, this time closer, too close. The sound changed too, from distant cracks to sharp impacts that echoed through the airframe. Then came the first hit. A dull, heavy thud vibrated through the aircraft, followed by another and another. Adair felt the P-40 shudder as rounds struck the fuselage and wings. Warning signs began to appear almost immediately. The aircraft didn't respond quite the same way. The controls felt different, not gone, but altered. He tightened his grip, compensating instinctively, trying to maintain control as he leveled out. But the fighters weren't giving him space. They pressed in from multiple angles, forcing him to react constantly. Every evasive maneuver cost him energy, altitude, and time. He tried to climb slightly. Another hit. He rolled. More tracers cut across his path. The air around him had become a trap. Still, he refused to disengage completely. Even under fire, even outnumbered, he kept maneuvering with one goal in mind: stay unpredictable, stay alive, and if possible, strike again. But the damage was adding up. Another burst hit the aircraft, louder this time, sharper. Something critical had been struck. He could feel it immediately. The controls responded with a delay, then resisted altogether in one direction. He tested it again. The response wasn't normal. Aileron control, partially gone. The aircraft began to drift unevenly, its balance disrupted. What had once been smooth, responsive movement was now sluggish and unpredictable, and at combat speeds, even a small delay could be fatal. Adair adjusted with rudder, forcing the aircraft back into alignment, but it wasn't enough to restore full control. He was compensating now, not flying. And the fight wasn't over. More tracers, more impacts. By now, the P-40 had taken multiple hits, far more than it was ever designed to withstand in a single engagement. The engine still roared, but the airframe was no longer the same machine that had charged forward just minutes earlier. Inside the cockpit, the situation was changing rapidly. This was no longer an attack. This was survival. Another hit struck, followed by a sudden jarring shift in the aircraft's behavior. The nose dipped slightly, then more aggressively. Adair pulled back on the stick, expecting resistance, but the response didn't come the way it should have. Something was very wrong. The aircraft began to roll and pitch in a way that didn't match his inputs. The balance was gone. The precision was gone. He was no longer fully in control. And at just a few thousand feet above the ground, in the middle of hostile airspace, surrounded by enemy fighters, his aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable. And the worst part was just beginning. Because whatever was damaged wasn't just affecting how the plane fought, it was about to determine whether it could even stay in the air.
The change was immediate, and it was unmistakable. One moment, the aircraft was still responding, imperfectly but enough to fight. The next, something critical gave way. The resistance in the controls vanished in one direction and locked in another. The balance that kept the P-40 stable in flight was suddenly gone. The nose dropped. Not gradually, not in a controlled descent. It fell. Adair pulled back on the stick, expecting the familiar resistance that would lift the nose and arrest the dive. But the response wasn't there. The aircraft continued downward, gaining speed with every passing second. The horizon tilted, then disappeared from view as the ground began to rise rapidly in front of him. At around 2,000 feet, there was no margin for error. He tried again, harder this time, pulling back, adjusting, forcing the controls to respond. Nothing.
The stick felt disconnected from the outcome, as if the aircraft was no longer listening. Another input, another correction, still nothing. The realization came fast and cold. This wasn't partial damage anymore. This was loss of control. Somewhere in the fuselage, the cables that linked his movements to the control surfaces had been severed or jammed. The ailerons, the elevators, parts of the system that kept the aircraft stable were no longer fully under his command. What remained was inconsistent, unpredictable, and rapidly becoming useless. The P-40 was now diving on its own. Training took over for a split second. Bail out. That was the rule. Clear, simple, repeated over and over again during flight instruction. If control is lost at low altitude, you don't troubleshoot, you get out. Every second spent trying to save the aircraft increases the risk of losing everything. At Luke Field, instructors had been blunt about it. Attempting to fly a critically damaged aircraft with compromised controls wasn't bravery, it was suicide. Pilots were told not to hesitate, not to second-guess. The procedure existed because too many had died trying to do exactly that. And now, in this moment, every part of that training was telling Adair the same thing: get out. But there was a problem. He was still in the middle of hostile airspace. Below him stretched dense jungle, broken terrain, and no guarantee of a safe landing even with a parachute. Japanese aircraft were still in the sky. Even if he managed to bail out cleanly, there was no certainty he would survive what came next: capture, injury, or worse. And then there was something else: the aircraft. Even as it dove, even as control slipped away, it was still flying. Not correctly, not safely, but it hadn't broken apart. The engine was still producing power. The structure was still holding. That meant one thing: some form of control still existed. The question was whether it could be found in time. The ground was getting closer now, fast enough that details were beginning to sharpen. Trees were no longer a green blur. They were individual shapes rising up to meet him. The dive angle steepened, the speed increasing beyond what the situation could tolerate. Adair forced himself to think, not react, not panic, think. If the primary control cables were damaged, then the normal relationship between stick movement and aircraft response was broken. But an airplane doesn't rely on just one system to stay in the air. There were secondary effects, forces that still acted on the aircraft even when direct control was compromised. He tested the rudder. A slight response. Not much, but something. He adjusted the throttle. The engine's power changed, and with it, the behavior of the aircraft shifted, subtly but noticeably. The nose didn't rise, but the rate of the dive altered just enough to feel. That was it, a fragment of control, not through the stick, through everything else. The idea formed in pieces, incomplete but urgent. If he couldn't control the aircraft directly, maybe he could influence it indirectly, use power, balance, and whatever remaining surfaces still responded to force the plane into something resembling stability. But there was almost no time to test it. The ground was dangerously close now. Adair made a decision, not the one he had been trained to make, but the only one that made sense in that moment. He wasn't going to bail out. Instead, he committed to the aircraft. He adjusted the throttle again, carefully this time, watching how the nose reacted. He applied rudder, countering the uneven roll that threatened to turn the dive into a spin. The movements were small, experimental, but each one gave him a little more information, a little more control. The dive began to change, not dramatically, but enough to matter. The angle reduced slightly. The rate of descent slowed just enough to feel the difference between certain impact and a narrow possibility of recovery. But the aircraft was still unstable, still unpredictable. One wrong input could send it back into a dive, or worse. And he was still far from safe. There were no guarantees that this would work beyond the next few seconds, no confirmation that the aircraft could be stabilized fully, or that it could even be flown for more than a minute like this. But the alternative was already clear: bail out and face whatever waited below, or stay and attempt something no one had ever taught, no one had ever recommended, and no one had ever expected to work. The manuals had given him one answer. Reality was forcing another, and as the ground rushed closer, Philip Adair chose to trust what he was discovering in that moment over everything he had ever been told. Because somehow, against every expectation, the aircraft was beginning to respond. Not the way it should have, but just enough to keep him alive.
Adair's mind worked faster than the aircraft beneath him. Every instinct, every ounce of training had to be recalibrated in real time. He no longer had the luxury of relying on standard controls. The stick didn't obey him in the usual way, the ailerons were jammed, and the elevators responded only partially. What remained were fragments, rudder, throttle, trim, and an acute sense of how the plane reacted under stress. Every adjustment counted. Every second was a choice between life and destruction. He discovered quickly that small, deliberate changes could influence the aircraft's behavior. Increasing power caused the nose to lift slightly. Reducing it allowed it to drop just enough to prevent stalling. Rudder inputs nudged the plane's roll, compensating for the jammed aileron. It was delicate, exhausting work, but it was working. Slowly, painfully, he began to regain a measure of stability, not through conventional control, but through intuition and constant observation. The next challenge was distance. Nagahuli Airfield lay 43 miles away, a journey that would normally take minutes under standard flight. Now every mile was a test. Adair had to maintain altitude and direction, all while continuously compensating for the damaged aircraft. He could not afford to relax, could not afford a single lapse in judgment. Each second in the sky was a battle, each adjustment a gamble against the forces of gravity, wind, and a crippled warplane. Enemy fighters were still in the air, though many had turned back, believing him too damaged to be a threat. That small reprieve was enough to let him focus entirely on the mechanics of survival. He noticed subtle patterns in how the plane reacted. A slight push of the throttle in combination with a rudder adjustment created a gentle turn. A combination of trim and rudder corrected minor dives. Every movement required precision and thought. There was no room for instinct alone. The stakes were impossibly high. As the miles slowly passed, the landscape below became more familiar. Hills and rivers that had seemed distant were now distinct shapes. The proximity to Nagahuli brought hope, but also danger. Ground crews had been watching the sky, and the unusual behavior of the aircraft nearly triggered anti-aircraft fire. Observers mistook the lone Warhawk for a hostile intruder. Adair had to signal with wing adjustments, a subtle, desperate form of communication that he hoped would be understood. The descent toward the airfield required even more careful control. Every approach angle, every throttle adjustment had to account for the damaged systems. The margin for error was microscopic. Too steep, and the aircraft could plunge uncontrollably. Too shallow, and he risked overshooting the runway. With every yard, the airfield drew closer, and the tension mounted. Finally, he reached the threshold. The nose had stopped dipping uncontrollably, speed was manageable, and rudder and throttle allowed him to guide the aircraft forward. Ground crews held their fire as they recognized the American Warhawk. Adair made a final delicate adjustment, guiding the plane along the runway with fragmented control. Tires touched down, and the aircraft skidded forward, wobbling but intact.
He had done what was considered impossible. Against every rule, every manual, every training doctrine, he had flown a nearly unmanageable aircraft for 43 miles under combat conditions. Every adjustment, every calculation, every heartbeat had been essential. That flight had not just saved a single plane, it had preserved Dinjan airfield, 14 C-47 transports, and the critical Hump airlift that depended on them. For those watching, it was a miracle. For Adair, it was understanding, focus, and courage converging in a moment of extreme necessity. The Warhawk had survived, the base had survived, and the lessons of that flight would remain unrecorded, known only to him, a testament to the unpredictable reality of combat.
The Warhawk finally skidded to a stop, and for a long moment silence filled the air. The ground crews, who had been frozen in disbelief, stepped closer, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The aircraft was battered and riddled with bullet holes, its control surfaces scarred, some nearly immobile, but it was still intact. Every piece of metal had survived a test no designer could have imagined. Every component that had kept it in the air had been pushed to its absolute limit. Adair climbed out, his hands trembling, sweat and grime streaking his uniform and face. His heart was still racing, and every muscle ached from the strain of holding the aircraft together mid-flight. For him, the relief was immediate, but tempered by the weight of what had just happened. He had performed a maneuver no training manual, no instructor had ever suggested. The Warhawk wasn't just a plane, it was a lifeline, a fragile extension of his own instincts, courage, and understanding of flight under extreme stress. That lifeline had preserved much more than itself. 14 fully loaded C-47 transports were still on the ground, waiting to deliver critical supplies over the Hump to China. Dinjan Airfield, a vital hub in the Allied effort across the China-Burma-India theater, remained untouched. The mission of the Hump airlift, already one of the most dangerous logistical operations of the war, could continue without interruption thanks to a single, daring act. Adair's solution in the air had been radical. He had flown without full control, relying on throttle, rudder, and trim to coax the aircraft through the sky, effectively turning partial control into usable control. It was a technique never documented, never taught, and never repeated because it required split-second judgment, deep understanding of aerodynamics, and absolute faith in instinct. It was improvisation at its most extreme, where physics, experience, and courage intersected, demanding every ounce of focus, nerve, and mental calculation a human being could summon. Every adjustment had to be precise, every second accounted for, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of that flight became legend among those stationed at Dinjan. Pilots and ground crews alike studied the flight in awe, though no formal report ever fully captured what Adair had done. Even decades later, historians note that this single decision, choosing to stay with a crippled aircraft rather than bail out, had saved lives, preserved supplies, and maintained a vital supply line for the Allied war effort. It was not just a tale of survival, it was an extraordinary display of human ingenuity under the most extreme circumstances. Adair returned to the skies, flying 139 combat missions in total. He achieved ace status, credited with multiple aerial victories, and eventually retired as a colonel in 1971. Yet that one morning over Assam stood apart. It was a moment when doctrine collided with reality, when training gave way to instinct, and when a single man's understanding of his aircraft under extreme stress made the difference between disaster and survival. The significance of that day extends far beyond the battle itself. It highlights a universal truth of combat. Procedures can guide, but they cannot replace the human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and courage under pressure. Adair's flight illustrates how knowledge of one's machine, combined with calmness under extreme danger, can turn an impossible scenario into a survival story that inspires generations. Ultimately, Philip Adair's experience serves as a reminder that history is often shaped not by plans, but by the quick decisions and extraordinary skill of individuals. One pilot, one aircraft, and one choice changed the fate of an airfield, protected lives, and kept a critical supply route open. The Warhawk Lulu Belle may have been damaged, but the legacy of that flight remains whole, etched forever in the annals of World War II as a testament to courage, ingenuity, human resilience, and the extraordinary potential of a single person facing overwhelming odds. It is a story that continues to teach, inspire, and astonish anyone who studies it. A reminder that in the chaos of war, understanding, courage, and split-second decisions can sometimes make the impossible possible.